Andy, is your sense that there is plausible proof behind this theory that the coronavirus, COVID-19, did originate in a Wuhan Chinese laboratory?
Well, I think the important thing to understand here first is we want to differentiate where the pandemic started from versus the process that got this virus into humans. So I think it's clear that this is not a virus that has been engineered in any way by humans. It seems to be a natural isolate. And we think that the way it became a human pathogen is because it went from bats into animals and then from animals into humans. And I think what the debate right now is about is that last step. Did that last step happen because of a person coming into contact with one of these intermediate animals and that launched the pandemic? Or is it a situation where a laboratory was working with this under unsafe conditions, there was some sort of a lab leak, and that caused the pandemic? You know, working on these viruses for over 20 years, I can tell you that the safety precautions that have to be put in place are really quite high. And so the likelihood of a lab release is really very, very, very low. However, as you've mentioned, there does seem to be some movement on the political side today and talk about information that hasn't been released yet, which is, I think, the big question mark right now.
Where did COVID-19 come from? At the moment, it raises more questions than clear answers. President Biden wants U.S. intelligence to determine if the virus jumped from animals to humans or somehow escaped from a lab in China. Amna Nawaz looks at what we know now.
That's right, Judy. The Trump administration emphasized it thought the coronavirus leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology in southern China, but the U.S. intelligence community has been split over this. Nick Schifrin's been reporting on this all day. He joins me now. Nick, it's good to see you. Let's just start with President Biden's call for this review. Why is this coming now?
Senior administration official says the overall motivation is that the world needs greater clarity on the origins of COVID-19 in order to prevent the next pandemic. But this week, the Biden team took affront to China's rejecting any calls to further investigation. Senior official tells me back in March, President Biden requested an assessment of the intelligence of the origins and that he received that. But on Tuesday, China rejected once again a call for a further investigation. And a senior official says that that led the White House to accelerate their declassification of the origins of COVID, leading to yesterday's statement calling for the intelligence community to redouble their efforts and a promise to release more information in the next 3 months.
Well, Nick, as Judy mentioned, one of the theories is that the virus escaped from a lab. What's the evidence for that?
Yeah, since the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, the intelligence community has examined the possibility that COVID-19 leaked from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, whose scientists have admitted in the past that they've experimented with bat viruses, including by making them more lethal, and of course happens to be in Wuhan. And last fall, the U.S. received new information that led to a State Department statement that said that several researchers at the lab became sick with a COVID-like 19 illness in the fall of 2019. The lab had a separate military-run area, and the lab, quote, altered and then removed online records of its work. Two former senior officials told me that those researchers got so sick they were hospitalized. But initially, the Biden team said that none of that is a smoking gun. In fact, in March, a senior intelligence official told me that that statement was, quote, not a complete story. The fact is, Ahmed, that the intelligence community has failed to create a definitive assessment. COVID could have leaked from the lab. COVID could have jumped from animals to humans. All of those theories are low to medium confidence within the intelligence community, and there's not even an agreement about them. The fact is there is no new intelligence today, according to officials, but a senior administration official tells me the White House thinks the intelligence community can do more and is trying to provide more resources to examine big data to the intelligence community to do so.
No one knows that.
It emerged naturally.
It's a scientific question that's ignited a political firestorm, now with renewed attention as the possibility of an accidental lab leak gains prominence. President Biden has even asked intelligence agencies to redouble their efforts to investigate the origins of COVID-19, and multiple probes have been launched around the world, including one led by the U.S. State Department and another by the World Health Organization.
We need to know the origin of this virus.
All determined to uncover the truth. Could this novel coronavirus come from the dark side of Mother Nature or from a lab? And if it did come from a lab, was it an accident, or could it have been an engineered bioweapon?
That deadly coronavirus now grows, spreading from Wuhan, China.
A city of 11 million people, home to several large wildlife markets, potential breeding grounds for viruses. But Wuhan is also home to one of the leading laboratories in the world studying bat coronaviruses. And from early on, that had people wondering. The evidence we do have is both circumstantial and scientific. The bustling city of Wuhan to remote caves in southern China, 1,000 miles away, to the genetic structure of the virus itself. And complicating the task of solving this mystery, the whole topic has become weaponized, a political cudgel.
They could have stopped it, but they allowed it to come out. China virus, Kung flu.
With some, like David Asher, who ran the State Department's investigation into the origins of the COVID virus, accusing China of negligence for not alerting the world sooner.
We're talking lights out. There was no cooperation, and there still is no cooperation.
So let's begin with an undisputed scientific fact. Viruses are constantly emerging from nature. So when you look at this virus with your expertise, you see the workings of evolution and of nature. You don't see the hand of some diabolical scientist cooking up coronavirus.
Absolutely. That just didn't happen at all.
Robert Gary of Tulane University is one of the world's leading virologists.
Look at the data a little closely. And I think that most scientists, and certainly most virologists that have already done this, will come to the conclusion that we're looking at a virus that came from nature.
Gary argues the genetic code of the virus looks like the kind of thing that happens randomly in nature, not in a lab.
It's really nothing that any experienced virologist or, even your worst graduate student would do.
And that remains the consensus among most virologists, that this coronavirus has none of the telltale fingerprints of overt bioengineering. So if this had been cooked up in a lab, you'd be able to see that?
Yes.
And we don't see that with this coronavirus?
We don't see that, no.
Dennis Carroll runs the Global Virome Project, an international effort to identify viruses in the wild that have the potential to trigger future pandemics. Carroll and many other virologists say every option should be explored, but there is another likely origin story. Wet markets, large open stall markets where live animals are sold.
In the wet market, you would find a menagerie of different wild and domestic animals all mixed together, and people will go in and purchase. Those conditions are very, very amenable to spillover events.
It's fall 2019.
The House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, has decided to open a formal impeachment.
An impeachment inquiry has just been announced.
Hurricane Dorian, growing over the past 24 hours.
As a hurricane brews in the Atlantic. But something else may have been brewing in Wuhan.
These satellite photos, seen here for the first time, show various Wuhan hospitals.
Evidence suggesting the virus was spreading. Then, in January 2020, all eyes turned to that live animal market in Wuhan. But a stubborn, puzzling fact emerged. Of the first several dozen cases of COVID in Wuhan, almost half of them cannot be traced back to that wet market. And the director of the Chinese CDC, Gao Fu, later revealed that none of the animal samples taken from the market tested positive for the virus either, adding, "At the beginning, we presumed that the seafood market may have the novel coronavirus, but now it turns out that the market is one of the victims."
They had hoped that they would find the host animal at that market, and that's not what they found. What we know now is that the virus was likely spreading in the city before it was detected. The wet market was actually the accelerating agent for the virus and not the initial spark.
The search for the virus's origin continued. investigators, including some inside the U.S. intelligence community, started focusing on a building a few miles from the wet market, the Wuhan Institute of Virology. Jamie Metzel is a member of the World Health Organization's expert committee on human genome editing. And like many others, he has long been concerned about the research that was taking place at the Wuhan Institute.
They were doing what some people have called gain-of-function research, seeing how the world's scariest viruses might infect human cells.
Do you think they were playing with fire?
Absolutely, I do. But there were lots of virologists who were in on this. And the idea was, let's understand these viruses so we know what we're facing. The counter-argument was, we're playing with fire. If it turns out that COVID-19 stems from an accidental lab incident from the Wuhan Institute of Virology, it will turn out that fear was certainly well-founded.
The Wuhan Institute is one of China's few level 4 labs with the highest level of biosecurity, enabling them to deal with the world's deadliest pathogens. It's famous in the scientific community. And so is its star researcher, Dr. Shizheng Li, dubbed the Batwoman for her work collecting and studying viruses from bats.
She said that none of the sequences of the viruses that she collected matches the COVID pandemic virus.
Yes.
Doesn't that clear the lab?
If you believe that, one, she has all the information, and two, she's telling the truth.
Dr. Shi admitted early in the pandemic that she was worried the virus could have leaked from her lab.
She told an American Science journal that she remembers thinking, oh my gosh, if this is a bat coronavirus, could my lab and the samples that I've been working with be involved? When Xi Jinping learned that none of the samples that had been collected of this new virus and the earliest cases of coronavirus didn't match any of the samples that she and her team had sequenced from bat caves in years prior, she breathed a sigh of relief.
The Wuhan lab had been collecting potentially deadly viruses for years, some from an abandoned copper mine in southwestern China.
In 2012, there were these 6 Chinese miners who were sent down into a mine in southern China to clean out the bat manure. They all got infected with what now looks like COVID-19-like symptoms. 3 of them died.
Researchers from the Wuhan lab collected viruses from those caves where similar coronaviruses have been found.
One of those coronavirus samples was 96% similar to the virus that has caused this pandemic. Politicians and non-scientists have speculated that it's possible that this virus was brought back into a lab and somehow transformed to become our current coronavirus. But what virologists say is that that's simply not the case.
There is no virus that's close enough that you could use any type of research to get to SARS-CoV-2. Now, you could hypothesize, I suppose, that the investigators at the Wuhan Institute of Virology had some virus that was closer, and they just weren't telling us about that.
Do you believe that this virus spent any time in a laboratory?
Before the pandemic, absolutely not.
My name is Dr. Mike Hansen, and I specialize in internal medicine, also pulmonary disease and critical care medicine, board certified in all 3. So let's break down the lab leak theory. Was an employee at the Wuhan virology lab accidentally infected and then spread the virus, especially if the initial contacts were asymptomatic? The largest collection of bat samples, especially ones containing bat coronaviruses, are housed at the WIV. Could poor lab techniques by inadequately trained technicians allow the virus to escape? Of course. Could researchers at the WIV have made the virus more virulent and transmissible by experimenting with gain-of-function mutations? Absolutely. These mutations are designed to hasten the evolutionary process so that scientists can be prepared for future pandemics. But this lab leak theory carries more controversy because it's more politically charged and has economic, social, and political implications. Unfortunately, this theory received only a brief mention in that WHO report. Only 4 out of 313 pages were actually devoted to that. Several researchers inside the WIV became ill in the fall of 2019 with symptoms that were consistent with COVID-19 or the seasonal flu. So back in that November, 3 WIV researchers became sick enough to seek hospital care. Dr. Robert Redfield believes the current pandemic began in Wuhan as a localized outbreak sometime in September through October of 2019, especially because of how well adapted this virus is to human ACE2 receptors. That's why he thinks that this was coming from a lab. The virus essentially hit the ground running. The program for monitoring emerging diseases did not formally notify the United States of the cluster of patients with pneumonia until December 31st of 2019. Dr. Robert Cadillac said that China used this 30-day lead time to purchase supplies. Dr. Redfield spoke with his Chinese counterpart, Dr. George Zhao, who was distraught that many people infected with COVID were not at that wet market. So, WIV researchers have published research on engineering the gain-of-function mutations in chimeric viruses. In other words, a man-made product from artificially fusing two different viruses together. Some of the work was funded by the NIH and by the U.S. Defense Threat Reduction Agency of Department of Defense through EcoHealth Alliance. U.S. intelligence agencies suggest that rat G13 may have been the backbone for this SARS-CoV-2. Other scientists have suggested that the combination of an optimized receptor binding site, where the virus binds to the human ACE2 receptor, and the furin cleavage site, which is a unique series of nucleotides that helps the virus enter human cells. So that might also provide evidence in favor of lab manipulation. David Relman is a microbiologist at Stanford, and he speculates that scientists may have been tempted to create a recombinant virus to study the furin cleavage site. So chimeras have been produced in the lab. These chimeras have bat coronavirus backbones and spike proteins that bind to human ACE2 receptors. The chimeras were meant to simulate natural genetic recombination events. Dr. Shi published a paper back in 2017 about an experiment in which she created new hybrid bat coronaviruses. Was the SARS-CoV-2 virus biologically engineered or manipulated? So the team led by Christian Anderson, a virologist at Scripps Research that's in La Jolla, California, determined that it was improbable. The genetic differences between SARS-CoV-2 and rat G13 are randomly spread throughout that genome. A genetic analysis suggests that SARS-CoV-2 didn't originate from rat G13, but since then, other virologists, including Dr. Alina Chan from MIT and Harvard, have refuted this. Nikolai Petrovsky, an Australian immunologist, studied the SARS-CoV-2 virus after Chinese released its genetic sequence. He said that the spike proteins studying SARS-CoV-2 bound more tightly to the human ACE2 receptor than target receptors on other species. His investigation came out at a time when scientists were saying that anything other than a natural origin of the virus was a conspiracy theory. The Chinese Ministry of Education sent out a directive, quote, "Any paper that traces the origin of the virus must be strictly and tightly managed." There is evidence that researchers at WIV removed and then altered online records of their work working with that rat G13 and other viruses. Here's a quote for you. "How on earth can I offer up evidence for something where there is no evidence?" That's what she said. But China's refusal to allow investigations into the lab has only furthered accusations.
The U.S. intelligence community is close to halfway through its 90-day investigation into the origins of COVID-19. It's looking into whether the virus emerged naturally through human contact with an infected animal or leaked from a lab in Wuhan, China. And CBS News senior investigative correspondent Catherine Herridge joins me now to explain what we're learning. Hi there, Catherine. Thank you for being here. So what are the two competing theories of how COVID-19 first reached humans?
Okay, and the first theory is called zoonotic. That's a very scientific term, but what it means is that the virus jumped to humans through an infected animal. So think about things like the wet market in Wuhan. We heard about that in the earliest days of the pandemic, and then also the wildlife trade. The second theory, the lab leak theory, is based on the premise that researchers at the Wuhan Institute of Virology were handling these highly contagious viruses, but there was some kind of spill or accidental exposure, so that the researcher was infected and then walked out of the lab with the virus. One of the things we learned in the course of our investigation here at CBS News from former State Department officials is that the research at the Wuhan lab was done at a bio-level safety 2. And we were told that's really the equivalent of a dentist's office or a doctor's office when you have a procedure. What you see here, these kind of bubble suits, that's a bio-level safety 4, and that was not the level at which the scientists were handling many of these viruses. So that video, I think, in many respects, has been very misleading over the course of the last year as to the type of safety protocols that were in place when they were handling these bat viruses.
And Catherine, earlier this year, the State Department released a fact sheet saying that they believed a handful of researchers at the Wuhan lab were sick with COVID-19-like symptoms in the fall of 2019. That's before the Chinese government went public with the virus. So former senior State Department official David Feith, who helped craft that fact sheet, told you that the information was solid and credible. Take a listen.
The U.S. government's information on this fact, on the lab workers being ill, was completely high confidence.
So what else did you learn about the intelligence here?
Well, Caitlin, one of the most striking things we learned from former government officials is that there was very significant information about the lab's activities in Wuhan in the late fall of 2019 before the Chinese government acknowledged the virus, and this information was buried in U.S. government databases. And in some cases, it took nearly a year to reach the desks of researchers here in Washington. This is important because it told us a lot more about the activities in the months leading up to the pandemic. And the second thing that we learned is that one of the government's top labs in this country, Lawrence Livermore, did a classified report that examined the likely origins of the virus behind COVID-19. And in May of 2020, the Lawrence Livermore labs found that it was plausible that it may have leaked from one of the laboratories. Yet that report did not reach the desks of these investigators until October and November of 2020, so about a 5-month gap. And it's very hard to understand how in the midst of this pandemic, that kind of information didn't really go up to the top priority list, but seemed buried.
Yeah, because back in 2020, in February of 2020, the lab leak theory was being called a conspiracy by scientists. What's changed since then?
Well, the simple answer is that we just know more today than we did in February of 2020, when in fact very little was known about the virus. CBS News has obtained these 2018 State Department diplomatic cables. A team from the U.S. government went into the lab in Wuhan, and what they found is that there were some significant deficits when it came to technicians handling these viruses. You can see the lab shortage of trained staff. So that opened up the possibility that there could be accidents in the lab. What we also know is that when investigators with the WHO went to Wuhan earlier this year, they had access blocked to a lot of data. And that was the finding of the WHO president, saying we need to have more access. And I think finally, there's no evidence of this zoonotic link. There's no evidence of the animal that would have been that intermediate bridge between the virus and humans. And this is in spite of the fact that the Chinese government has tested over 80,000 samples, wildlife, livestock, poultry, looking for this animal that may be the bridge. So in some respects, it's a circumstantial case, but what's equally important is the lack of evidence which has come to support this zoonotic or animal link.
I'm still struck by what former CDC Director Dr. Robert Redfield told me in February.
I am of the point of view that I still think the most likely etiology of this pathogen in Wuhan was from a laboratory, escaped.
For a lot of people, it was stunning. Not so much what was said, after all, the lab leak theory had been out there for some time, but rather that the former director of the CDC was the one saying it. Someone with access to raw data and intelligence many others didn't have.
That's the way I put it together.
After largely being dismissed by the scientific community, the lab leak theory is now gaining new momentum.
We know that all laboratories everywhere in the world have had accidents, continue to have accidents, despite our very best efforts to prevent them.
David Rauman is a microbiologist and professor at Stanford. He penned a letter, along with 17 other scientists in the journal Science, writing, quote, "More investigation is still needed to determine the origins of the pandemic. Theories of accidental release from a lab and zoonotic spillover both remain viable." Now the question is, will we ever know? According to the World Health Organization, this coronavirus is 96% similar to another virus found in bats known as RATG13.
It's not close enough to say that it's the exact virus that gave rise to this one in a simple evolutionary step. That kind of gap, 4%, means years, means decades in terms of natural evolutionary time.
And that evolution means something. Typically, after a virus makes the jump from animal to human, it sputters along, evolving, learning how to become more efficient. That takes time. With SARS-CoV-2, the virus seemed to come screaming out of the gates.
Normally when a pathogen goes from a zoonotic to human, it takes a while for it to figure out how to become more and more efficient in human-to-human transmission.
So in the lab, do you think that that process of becoming more efficient was happening? Is that what you were suggesting?
You know, most of us in the lab, we're trying to grow a virus. We try to help make it grow better and better so we can do experiments and figure out about it.
According to two people briefed on U.S. intelligence, well before the first cluster of cases in Wuhan was reported to the WHO on December 31st, 2019, there were concerning reports of researchers from the Wuhan Institute of Virology becoming sick with some sort of pneumonia-like illness. Were they the first patients in the world to contract COVID? We don't know, and we were told they tested negative for antibodies, but that hasn't been independently confirmed.
CNN has learned that President Biden was briefed on a 90-day review by the intelligence community on the origins of COVID, and sources say it reflects low confidence in either of the origin theories, a lab leak or a natural emergence. An unclassified version of the report could be released by the end of the week, and CNN's David Culver was in Wuhan as the pandemic began, and he's been looking into these theories.
The evidence supporting a lab leak for now is all circumstantial, starting with the lab's location. The BSL-4 lab, or Biosafety Level 4, is about 25 miles from the Huanan seafood market. That is where many of the first COVID-19 cases initially emerged.
I don't think anyone would disagree that the major first amplification occurred in Wuhan.
The Chinese have pushed back against the claim the virus was engineered. But if the first amplification was from a lab, that would suggest either a lab worker unknowingly got infected or that the virus was isolated and or manipulated in a lab and somehow got out, sparking concern over the type of research that might have been taking place here. CNN spoke with a source directly involved with the construction of the BSL-4. Using their insight, along with information published by the Chinese before the outbreak, here's what we know. Planning and construction of the BSL-4 started in 2003. In 2018, it officially became operational. It's located on the sprawling, fenced-in Wuhan Institute of Virology campus. The building containing the lab sits separate. 4 levels make up the structure. At the top, a sophisticated air purification system. At the bottom and underneath the lab, decontamination equipment that allows for safe sewage disposal. Level 2, this is where the research takes place. There are separate entrances and exits, along with dedicated dissection rooms, virus storage facilities, and multiple labs for distinct animal and cellular level research. French engineers helped in the planning and the construction. But one source tells us the Chinese were initially resistant in adding some basic safety features due to the high cost of some equipment, such as multiple chemical decontamination showers, but that they eventually relented adding them. Some have also questioned the lab staff's training. A 2018 diplomatic cable sent by U.S. officials who made a site visit stated that, quote, the new lab has a serious shortage of appropriately trained technicians and investigators needed to safely operate this high containment laboratory. The cable went on to say that the University of Texas Medical Branch in Galveston, UTMB, has scientific collaborations with WIV, which may help alleviate this talent gap over time. Scott Weaver of UTMB tells me the collaborations with the Wuhan Institute of Virology were minor and did not involve coronavirus research. He has not visited Wuhan's BSL-4 lab, but stresses that the training required for such a lab is extensive.
Typically, the scientists are wearing spacesuits. These are suits that are they're very expensive, very well designed to be airtight, and they're pumped full of filtered air, such that even if an accident occurred in the lab and there was some kind of a spill and an aerosol would be created, that spacesuit would prevent that aerosol from entering the breathing space of the scientists to infect them.
But other red flags came from the Chinese themselves, including WIV's director, Yang Jiming, who in 2018 co-authored a paper pointing out safety issues across all biosafety labs in China, warning in part that there was a lack of enough operable technical standards. But ultimately, many international experts viewed the Wuhan Institute of Virology's BSL-4 as one of the most sophisticated in the world, and its researchers more than competent.
You had a first-class facility, high-class virologists, and well-trained staff. You put all of that together and you'd say, well, I can't exclude a lab accident. It doesn't seem likely.
China has shut the door on future visits by the WHO. Chinese officials believe the origins investigation has become politically manipulated by the U.S., especially given Biden's order for an intel community review, one that focuses in part on the lab leak theory. Without any concrete proof, experts warn that prematurely concluding COVID-19 started from a lab leak might leave the world and scientific community divided over geopolitics and less prepared for future outbreaks.
So where does all of this factor in when it comes to Biden's intel community review, which essentially looks like it's going to be inconclusive, Brianna? Well, when you ask folks how this started and you look at how politicized it is here, it seems like we're never going to know that answer, at least if it continues at this rate. It is so sensitive here, Brianna. You've got a massive propaganda campaign that has launched that is relentless, pushing the lab leak theory.